Well, let us start with the breakdown of the ceasefire. There was a ceasefire agreement, which was in three phases. Phase one was end of hostilities, and phase two was involved the Israeli withdrawal, complete Israeli withdrawal from Gaza. And phase three involved planning for the reconstruction of Gaza, so a political solution to the Gaza problem. And what happened was that when the ceasefire agreement was signed, one of Netanyahu's extremist allies, Itamar Ben-Gvir, resigned from the government. And another extremist minister, Bezalel Smotrich, threatened to resign if the war is not resumed. So when phase one ended on the 2nd of March, Netanyahu rejected or violated the ceasefire. He was not prepared to move to phase two and start withdrawing Israeli forces from Gaza. And then Ben Gvir returned to the government, and Smotrich did not leave, did not resign from the government. So what this means is that Netanyahu's government is incapable of making peace. It's a government which can only wage war. And that explains why Netanyahu refused to move to phase two. Now, I'd like to make another point about Netanyahu. This war is a strategic disaster for Israel. It doesn't serve any national interest, and it doesn't serve any American national interest. This war continues for one reason and one reason only, that Netanyahu needs this war in order to survive politically. And Netanyahu has the dubious distinction of being a fugitive from justice at home, where he's on trial on serious corruption charges, and there is an international criminal court warrant for his arrest. So he's doubly a fugitive from justice, justice at home and justice abroad. His only way to survive politically is by continuing this war and keeping his Netanyahu refused to move to phase two. Now, I'd like to make another point about Netanyahu. This war is a strategic disaster for Israel. It doesn't serve any national interest, and it doesn't serve any American national interest. This war continues for one reason and one reason only, that Netanyahu needs this war in order to survive politically. And Netanyahu has the dubious distinction of being a fugitive from justice at home, where he's on trial on serious corruption charges, and there is an international criminal court warrant for his arrest. So he's doubly a fugitive from justice, justice at home and justice abroad. His only way to survive politically is by continuing this war and keeping his coalition afloat. Once he stops the war, the coalition will disintegrate. He will cease to be prime minister. He would have to go on trial, and most probably he would end up in prison. So this is something that it's not just my opinion. Yesterday in the Financial Times, Ehud Barak, a former Israeli prime minister, former Israeli chief of staff, and the most decorated soldier in Israel's history, wrote exactly what I've just told you, that this war is a strategic disaster for Israel. And the only way that it is continuing is to serve Netanyahu's political survival. I don't use the term genocide lightly. And I hesitated a long time before making up my mind that this is a genocide and before agreeing to the title, Genocide in Gaza. In my autobiography, 3 words, Memoirs of an Arab Jew, I wrote, "For all of Israel's sins, it's never been guilty of genocide." And a reader wrote to me and said, "This is what you wrote. Do you still think that?" And I had to reconsider, and I said, no, I no longer believe that, because now Israel has started committing genocide. And one of the things that made me change my mind was precisely the siege, the starvation of people, using starvation as a weapon of war. That is genocide. And the Convention for the Prevention of and Punishment of Genocide defines genocide. It says genocide is the intent to destroy in whole or in part a racial or religious or ethnic group. That's the definition of genocide, and this is what Israel is doing. It's trying to destroy the Palestinians in Gaza. And the siege is very, very important, the blockade, because since the 2nd of March, for 10 weeks, Israel imposed a total siege. It didn't allow any trucks with food or water or medicine. The enormity of this is huge. It's a huge punishment, and a blockade is illegal because a blockade is collective punishment which is prescribed by international law. But this has been a particularly brutal siege of innocent civilians. The statistics tell part of the story, but I would like to mention just one case that happened 2 days ago. There was a woman doctor in Gaza who went to work in the hospital. Her house was bombed. 9 out of her 10 children were killed. 1 child was injured, and her husband was seriously injured. So that is an indication of the brutality of the Israeli siege and blockade of Gaza.
Now, explain your understanding of what's significant about everything after October 7th, 2023, compared to all these different military operations launched after the assumption of power by Hamas in the battles they had with Fatah back in the first decade of this century. What is different about what happens after October 7th as opposed to what happens beforehand? Or is it just simply a continuation of everything?
Hamas won a fair and free election in January 2006, but Israel did not recognize the Hamas government and did not allow it to govern. And the United States and European Union supported Israel in refusing to recognize the Hamas government and in resorting to economic warfare to undermine it. There was a plot to which America was a part to encourage Fatah, the rival of Hamas, to carry out a coup d'etat, and Hamas preempted by seizing power in Gaza. And since 2007, Hamas has ruled Gaza on its own. Now, in 2008, Israel launched Operation Cast Lead. This was the first Israeli military offensive in Gaza. It was completely unnecessary because Egypt had brokered a ceasefire between Israel and Hamas. The ceasefire worked really well, And if all Israel wanted was to protect its citizens, all it had to do was to follow Hamas's good example and observe the ceasefire. But Israel broke the ceasefire. And let me say this, everything that I know suggests that every single ceasefire between Israel and Hamas was broken by Israel when it no longer suited it, including the one we were just talking about. The last ceasefire was violated by Israel, not by Hamas. There have been repeated Israeli military offensives in Gaza, very destructive with a lot of casualties. By my count, the current war is the 8th Israeli military offensive in Gaza. But it's very, very different because until now, the aim of these military offensives was what Israeli generals call to mow the lawn, to cut the grass, which means it's a chilling metaphor. It means that every couple of years, Israel moves in with a lot of military power, inflicts a lot of death and destruction, degrades the military capability of Hamas, and then withdraws. And this repeats itself time and again. And under this rubric, the next war is always round the corner. But the war in Gaza is different because the Hamas-led attack on Israel on the 7th of October 2023 unhinged Israeli society. Israelis can no longer think straight. They no longer behave rationally. There is enormous. The attack unleashed a huge, really, it broke the dam of hatred, and there is deep hatred of the Palestinians, and there is a quest for revenge, and revenge is not a policy. But what? So the IDF has killed over 53,000 people in Gaza, around 18,000 children. 70% of the casualties in Gaza are women and children, innocent people. If you add up the casualties of all the previous military offensives, they don't amount to a fraction of the casualties in this case. Moreover, Israel has destroyed 70% of the civilian infrastructure and the housing in Gaza. There was never destruction on that scale before. And the aim of this war was the ethnic cleansing of Gaza. There was a government plan to depopulate Gaza, to push the people of Gaza into northern Sinai. But Egypt has resisted, and therefore this hasn't had. Ethnic cleansing was a goal, but it wasn't achieved. The goal that was achieved is an undeclared goal, which is to make Gaza uninhabitable. Israel has also, there are 2.3 million people in Gaza. 2 million people, about 90% of the population, have been forced by the IDF to move. Some of them have been forced to move 10 times or more than 10 times, to move away from their homes, to live in tents. And some of the Gazans, after they obeyed the IDF orders to move, were bombarded from the air. And let me remind you or state that the forcible removal, displacement of displacement of citizens is a war crime. So Israel has been committing war crimes on a daily basis for the last 19 months. But now I'll come to the key point in answer to your question. What's new about this military offensive? What is new is genocide. And genocide is not a question of numbers. It's the intent to destroy a whole society. So in this war, unlike all the previous military offensive, Israel's aim, Israel is committing the crime of crimes, genocide.
Now, United States foreign policy, you have an essay in this book, and again, we're talking with Professor Avi Shlaim, who is a retired professor from Oxford University. He's the author of a new book, which I think will not come out completely, it might be opposite here, The Genocide in Gaza, published by the Irish Pages Press. And that's available from the Irish Pages Press directly. The issue of American foreign policy with Biden and now Trump, and then you have the articles that appear in the American press about the Gaza Humanitarian Foundation that was set up, which is essentially setting up initially 4 clusters where they were supplying food because there was this great hue and cry that UNRWA is infiltrated by Hamas, that all the food coming in is being sold to help rearm Hamas. Um, and yet, of course, if you see where these centers are being set up, they're being set up in the southern part of the Gaza Strip so that if people want to get food, they can they have to go and actually schlep literally quite long distance, and in some cases up in the north, it becomes difficult for them to get access to food easily. And they're only talking about supplying food to 1.2 million people. So, how do you make a sense of or take on all that going on?
This plan, the Gaza Aid Foundation, is part of a more general Israeli attack on the UN and a campaign that Israel has been leading against the United Nations and particularly UNRWA, the UN agency that looks after Palestinian refugees. So Israel passed a law to make it unlawful for Israelis to cooperate with UNRWA. Israel has, in effect, neutralized UNRWA, the body with the resources to continue to provide services, health and education services, and food to the enclave. And so Israel has tried to dismantle the UN agency, which is built for this purpose. And now it's come up for this very bizarre idea of a different system of aid, which is controlled by Israel, completely controlled. And that goes against the basic principle of international aid, which is the aid provider has to be neutral. And all the aid agency and the UN are opposed to the Israeli plan because it goes against all the principles of aid. Israel wants to politicize aid and to be able to control, to use the food, the supply of food, to use it in order to implement its political agenda for the Strip, which is to move as many people as possible from the north and center of Gaza to the south of Gaza. So what would happen to the million people in the north and in the south? Israel has no plan to provide food for them. So the UN and all the aid agencies quite rightly have rejected the Israeli plan as totally improper and inadequate for the needs of the people, of the population.
Now, the question of settler colonialism comes into play. Again, a term I do not like to throw aimlessly. For Americans, of course, it's a very tender term to talk about because our own history is based on settler colonialism. So Americans, of course, have to sit there and query the establishment of colonies in New England, in Virginia, in South Carolina, that are indeed products of that phenomenon. But in your particular case, you're talking about the sort of attachment of political Zionism with settler colonialism. And what's your response to when people say, well, look what happens in the late 19th century. You're dealing with anti-Semitism in Russia, pogroms after the assassination of the Tsar, uh, Theodore Herzl going to the Dreyfus trial and reacting to the anti-Semitism that he experiences in Europe. But what is your response to those kind of arguments, and how do you understand the interconnection of political Zionism and settler colonialism?
I'm glad you asked me the question about settler colonialism because it's key. The Zionist movement was a settler colonial movement, and the state of Israel is a settler colonial state. And the logic of settler colonialism is the elimination of the natives, in order to take over the land and its resources. And the war in Gaza is the latest and the cruelest phase in this century-old movement of settler colonialism. And the extremists in Netanyahu's government want not just permanent security control over Gaza, they want the reconquest of the whole of Gaza, the ethnic cleansing of Gaza, and the resettlement of Gaza. They want to resettle Gaza with Jews. So that's the climax, the cruel climax of settler colonialism. And there is no getting away from that. This is a colonial, the Palestinians are are fighting a war against a brutal colonial power. Now, Noam Chomsky, the Jewish American intellectual, once said that settler colonialism is the most extreme and vicious form of imperialism. And for the last century, the Palestinians have had the unique misfortune of being at the receiving end of Zionist settler colonialism on the one hand, and Western imperialism on the other hand, first under Britain and then under America. And when I talk about genocide in Gaza today, I blame not only Israel. Israel is mainly responsible, but I blame America as well. America is not just complicit in Israel's war crimes. America is not just complicit in Israeli genocide. America is an active partner because America provides Israel with the means to carry out the genocide. Since the 7th of October, America has given Israel over $21 billion in military aid. America gives Israel $3.8 billion every year. But in this period, it's given Israel $21 billion in military aid. The American president is the only person on earth who could stop the genocide. He could pick up the phone to Netanyahu and say, I give you 48 hours to stop the genocide. If not, I'm going to cut off military aid. But no American president has ever done that.
Yeah, it was sort of interesting. They had the next door neighbor of Elias Rodriguez, who assassinated these two young Israelis in Washington, on the TV this morning, and he was talking about President Eisenhower during the 1956 crisis, basically ordering the British and the French and the Israelis to withdraw from the canal and also the Suez.
Um, Chris A.G. is the editor of he's my publisher, and the book is published by Irish Pages Press. And Ireland is the most pro-Israeli, pro-Palestinian country in Europe. And this book is an Irish book because the Irish knew they suffered under British colonialism, so they know what it is like. And the coda to this book is by the iconic Irish barrister Blinia Ní Crawley, who made the speech to the ICJ about, as part of the South African delegation, the speech before the ICJ about genocide. And this speech went viral, and it's included at the end of the book. So the book is about settler colonialism, and Ireland is the friend of any anti-colonial movement. So that's all I have to say in answer to the question. Some South African experts have said that South African apartheid was much, that Israeli apartheid is much more severe and serious than South African apartheid, because South African apartheid, they put the blacks in reservations in their own areas. They imposed a lot of restrictions. They denied them political rights, but they didn't exterminate them. They didn't starve them, and they exploited cheap labor. Because whereas Israel has built a wall around Gaza, it's turned it into an open-air prison, the biggest open-air prison in the world. And conditions for people in Gaza are worse than they are in a prison, because in a prison at least you get water, you get food, you get medical attention, whereas the people in Gaza get nothing. So to repeat what I said, this is the cruelest phase of Zionist settler colonialism.
Yeah, as someone who actually has expertise on Southern Africa, and who's familiar with the literature on settler colonialism, it's interesting that if you compare the kind of attitudes the Labor Party had when they came into power and were administering the occupied territories after the Six-Day War, they, in some cases, with Yigal Allon's plan to use cheap Palestinian labor to come into Israel and essentially pacify the population. Because I had friends of mine in the IDF who fought on the West Bank against the PLO in the early stages of that counterinsurgency campaign. It reminds me of the kind of labor ideas that the South Africans had in terms of exploiting labor around.
The question about genocide. The question is there evidence that Israel has the intent to commit genocide? And my answer is that the evidence is overwhelming. And the evidence is presented in the chapter in the book, which is called Israel's Road to Genocide. And in this chapter, it draws on a database of statements made by Israeli leaders that indicate the intent to genocide. And the statements are countless at all levels, starting with President Herzog, who said that there are no innocent people in Gaza. So all the people in Gaza become guilty, including children and women. Then there is a statement from Benjamin Netanyahu, who compared the people in Gaza to Amalek. Amalek is a biblical reference to an enemy called Amalek, and the Bible calls for destroying Amalek. Women, children, men, old men, including the animals of the enemy. Total destruction, that is genocide, to wipe out the enemy. And every Israeli would have picked up the reference to Amalek in the statement by Netanyahu. And then there are endless statements by lower ranking, more not such senior officials, including the chairman of the Knesset, many members of the Likud, but most importantly, the two men who set the tone in this government, and that is Ben-Gvir and Smotrich. Smotrich has said after Israel violated the ceasefire that the aim now is not just to expand and intensify the military offensive, it's to take over the whole of Gaza, to empty it of its people, and to resettle Jews in Gaza. That's all evidence for genocide. But if you want more evidence, then I refer you to the chapter in my book. And the second question was about Zionism. There are different strands of Zionism. Indeed, there is the Labour strand and the Likud strand, or nationalist strand. The Labour strand wants to settle the conflict by the partition of the land, to partition the land with the Palestinians, and Labour agreed to a two-state solution. So the solution is partition. But the Likud and the parties further to the right, like the two parties that I've already mentioned, Zionist, religious Zionism led by Smotrich, and Jewish Power led by Itamar Ben-Gvir. These parties reject any Palestinian rights over the whole land of Israel. Israel is a racist state. It's the only racist state, the only member of the United Nations which is officially a racist state. My evidence for that is the July 2018 Jewish nation-state law, which says that Jews have a unique right to self-determination in the state of Israel. So that creates two categories of people, so that's racist. But the present government is much more extreme than that, because the policy guidelines of the present government says Jews have a unique right to self-determination. Sorry, Jews have an exclusive right to self-determination in the whole land of Israel, which means also Judea and Samaria, as they call it. Jews have an exclusive right to self-determination from the river to the sea. So this government is a Jewish supremacist government which treats Palestinians as inferior. It's a Jewish supremacist government, and this government has dehumanized the Palestinians, not just the people, not just Hamas, not just the people in Gaza. It's dehumanized the whole of the Palestinian people. And I will refer you to one famous statement made by Yoav Gallant, the former Minister of Defense, there is an ICC arrest warrant for him. And he said, after the attack on Israel, he said, we are going to stop water, food, and medicines going into Gaza because we are fighting human animals. Human animals. So that is the dominant position in the political establishment of Israel, that Palestinians are not equal, they are not human beings, and therefore by demonizing a people, you pave the way to genocide. With Hamas and Netanyahu's attitude towards Hamas, Netanyahu's line was that the Palestinians were defeated, that the Palestinian Authority was completely ineffectual, Israel had a free hand to do whatever it wanted on the West Bank, and Hamas governed Gaza, but was effectively contained within the prison, didn't threaten Israel's security. On the 7th of October, Hamas did attack inside Israel for the first time, invaded Israel, um, and the whole of his policy. And one further point that Netanyahu used to make is that Israel can make peace agreements, Abraham Accords, with the Arab world, with Saudi Arabia being the main target, without making any concessions to the Palestinians, without ending the occupation. That was his policy, but it completely collapsed overnight with on the 7th of October. Now, let's turn to Hamas. I don't defend Hamas. I completely denounce the attack on the 7th of October, in as much as it was directed against civilians. And it's very important to distinguish between combatants and non-combatants. The Palestinians live under military occupation, and therefore under international law they're allowed resistance, including armed resistance. And in the initial phase of the attack, Hamas attacked Israeli bases and killed 350 Israeli soldiers and security people. That's legitimate under international law. What's totally illegitimate is the harming of civilians. Now, I want to make one further point, and that is that the Western media only reports the Israeli narrative about that war, about that attack. It doesn't ever report the Hamas narrative. And Hamas issued its own account of what happened, and it says there were specific instructions to its soldiers to attack specific military targets. And it admits that things got out of hand and civilians and atrocities were committed. And this is the important point. Hamas agrees to an international investigation by a neutral body. It can be the ICC or it can be any other neutral body to come and examine what happened on that day. And it's prepared to punish those who transgressed. Whereas Israel does not allow any journalists to go into Gaza. It prevents journalists from going into Gaza, and Israel refuses to have any independent investigation of its own war crimes. So once again, Hamas's position is much more open and honest than the Israeli position on what happened on the 7th of October.
What is brilliant about Avi's book is he assembles the evidence and then makes the succinct generalization. And there's one sentence after this huge amassing of evidence, which goes as follows. Whether Israeli decision makers favored annihilation or expulsion, and whether they did so for reasons of deterrence, vengeance, or settlement, the policy upshot and the practical bottom line was the same. Gaza was to be rendered permanently uninhabitable. We are now rolling out the Gaza Nakba, Minister of Agriculture Avi Dichter explained. The civilian population would be given choices to stay and starve or to leave. And under the fourth item of the Genocide Convention, that is genocide. There's 5 principles, and one is to render, the intent to render an unsustainable. I think the phrase is, I can come back to it. But the Genocide Convention is a convention between state parties, and there's 5 criteria. It's very clear, as my son, a genocide and Holocaust scholar, points out eternally, that the 4 first principles of the Genocide Convention, which is between states, it's not individuals, it's state parties, they are actually clearly fulfilled. And the 4th one, in which the intent is to create conditions that render life insupportable, or I can't quite remember the phrase, unbearable, is actually part of one of the four definitions of genocide. So there's absolutely, if you take Israel's road to genocide, and you take the evidence that is amassed page after page, and you apply the first four principles of the Genocide Convention to that, there is no doubt, and it doesn't take a judicial determination. Any scholar, any historian, any writer can make the same determination by reading the Lemkin-inspired text and applying the historical account.
And we are agreed about what happened on the 7th of October. And it was a war crime because of the attack on civilians, and killing civilians is wrong, period. And it's wrong when it's done by Hamas, and when Israel kills civilians for political purposes, which is the definition of terrorism, it's I call it state terrorism. But the point that I want to make to you is that Israel was attacked, and it responded, but its response had to be within the limits of international humanitarian law. And this is where Israel has gone wrong, because its response has been completely brutal and vicious and inhuman, and it involved systematic violation of all the rules of international law. Benjamin Netanyahu grew in a very right-wing nationalistic home. His father, Ben-Zion Netanyahu, was the political secretary of 𝐆𝐸 Jabotinsky, the spiritual father of the Israeli right, and the architect of the strategy of the Iron Wall. And the strategy said that the strategy of the Iron Wall was written in an article published in 1923. It was called The Iron Wall, We and Our Neighbors, We and the Arabs. And it said the Palestinians are a people, they are not a rabble. No people in history has ever agreed to another people coming and building a state on its land, and therefore Arab opposition to the Zionist project is inevitable and inescapable. The only way to realize the Zionist project of a Jewish state in the Middle East is through building unassailable strength, an iron wall. The Arabs would hit their heads against the ramparts, and then they'll give up any hope of defeating the Jews on the battlefield, and then would come the time for negotiations. Now, the trouble with Netanyahu and the extreme right is that they only adopted the first part of Jabotinsky's strategy, building up military force, but they neglected the second part, which is using this force to negotiate from strength with the Palestinians. And Netanyahu is a good example of that. He doesn't believe in a political settlement with the Palestinians. He's a proponent of permanent conflict. And he has written a long book with his political creed, and there isn't a single positive reference in that entire book to Arabs, to their culture, to their civilization, to their history. He denounces all Arabs as irrational fanatics and terrorists. So he's not someone who is prepared today even to consider a political settlement in Gaza. He refuses to discuss any scenario for the day after. He only wants permanent Israeli control over Gaza and the depopulating of Gaza. And to conclude, I would say Netanyahu's entire political career, his political mission is to prevent the emergence of a Palestinian state. And he has repeated this time and again. He wants to prevent the emergence of a Palestinian state. And in the chapter on Netanyahu, which I wrote for this book, I quote him as saying to the British journalist Sir Max Hastings back in 1972, he says to Hastings, we want to get rid of the Palestinians, but we can't do this in peacetime. If there is a war, we would be able to get rid of the Palestinians from the West Bank and Gaza. We'll be able to get rid of the Palestinians from the occupied territories, and we might also be able to get rid of the Palestinians inside the state of Israel. So that's what he said back in 1972. And I'm really worried today that Netanyahu's current objective is not just the ethnic cleansing of the occupied territories, but he also wants to turn against the Palestinian citizens of the state of Israel.
In light of that, can you just quickly comment on the idea that in addition to annihilation or expulsion, as described in the chapter Israel's Road to Genocide, one of the main purposes is what you call politicide, to destroy entirely the possibility of a Palestinian national movement. Could you expand on that? Would you talk about?
Yes. Politicide is a concept which was developed by the late Israeli sociologist Baruch Kimmerling, and he wrote a book on politicide, Ariel Sharon and his war against the Palestinian, and he defined politicide as the attempt to prevent a national group from forming national institutions. Well, I'm sorry, I can't remember the exact definition, but politicide is the attempt to deny any political independence to a people. And this is what Netanyahu is doing. He is engaged in a systematic attempt to deny any political independence or sovereignty to the Palestinian people. So this is politicide.
I actually have the quote here, a process that has as its ultimate goal the dissolution of the Palestinians' existence as a legitimate social, political, and economic entity, in addition to just annihilating or expelling them.
Yes.
Okay. Now, I want to let everyone know we're talking with Professor Avi Shlaim, who's the author of a new book, Genocide in Gaza, Israel's Long War on Palestine. This is published by the Irish Pages Press, and one can obtain this book directly by going to their website and ordering it.
It's a question about whether Israel is a racist state, and I agree with the claim that many countries are racist. Myanmar is a racist state. China is a racist state. The point that I wanted to make is that countries don't describe themselves as racist. They don't announce their racism. They just have racist practices. This is why Israel is different, because it has a basic law, the July 2018 Jewish nation state law. And it's not just an ordinary law. Israel doesn't have a written constitution, but it does have basic laws that define the character of the state. And this is one of them. It's a basic law which makes it a racist state because only Jews have, under the definition, under that law, only the Jews have a unique right to self-determination in Israel. So that makes Israel officially a racist state. That's the point that I tried to make. Then the second point was about Hamas. Hamas is racist, and the 1988 Charter of Hamas was very crudely racist and overtly racist in the comments it made about the Jews. But Hamas has undergone an evolution, and the 2017 principles that it issued go back on many of they replace the original charter, and it's much more nuanced. And the principal point that it makes in the 2017 document is that Hamas's fight is not against Jews, and its problem is not with Jews or with Judaism. Its problem is with Israel, with Zionism, and the occupation. And it's fighting not Jews, it's fighting Zionism and the occupation. It's a resistance movement. And finally, the the murder of two Israeli officials in America reopened the whole debate about anti-Semitism and anti-Zionism. I don't want to go into the details of what happened in America, but to say categorically that there is a distinction between anti-Semitism on the one hand and anti-Zionism on the other hand. Anti-Semitism is the hatred of Jews because they are Jews. Anti-Zionism is objections, criticisms of Zionism, which is the official ideology of the State of Israel, or of its practices, especially in relation to the Palestinians. Now, Israel and its many friends in the West deliberately, I repeat, deliberately conflate anti-Zionism with anti-Semitism in order to silence even legitimate criticism of the State of Israel. So I insist that the two must be kept separate, and it's true that they can shade into one another. It's possible that someone who is critical of Israel is underneath also an anti-Semite. But what I would like is, if before you accuse anyone of anti-Semitism, if they only criticize Israel, you have to produce evidence that they are motivated by hatred of Jews. And in most cases, this would not be the case. Most people who criticize Israel today are not anti-Semitic. They are supporters of Palestinian rights, and are highly critical of what Israel is doing, of the ethnic cleansing and genocide. So let's bear in mind the fundamental distinction between anti-Semitism and anti-Zionism.
Thank you. And I should add, before we conclude with Ralph and Alex, when one looks at the attack on American higher education, well underway right now. Anti-Semitism is, and I'm somebody who went to Columbia. I know exactly how this issue has been debated for 50 years. I encountered people who would say anti-Semitic things in the process of both professors and students. But to say that it's like some raging mass crowd is ridiculous, absurd. And what's really the aim of using anti-Semitism as a weapon in the higher education is to mold and remold the American academy into a conservative tool of thought. They explicitly say this. Ralph, go on, Ralph.
Yeah, I agree. You can make a distinction certainly between anti-Semitism and anti-Zionism. I would just argue that anti-Zionism is wrong. I'd argue on that basis. But part of the problem with the anti-Zionist narrative is this notion of settler colonialism. And what I was beginning to say is a part of the flaw in that is that the Zionist movement did not have a mother country, in Europe, that they were colonizing in favor of. What they were trying to do was to save a population in Europe, which they knew was suffering from a lot of discrimination and a threat widespread in Europe, which eventually became genocide, real genocide, which murdered a majority of the Jews in the entire continent of Europe. Um, so the fact that they were successful during the mandate in establishing a community of about 600,000 people, I'd say that they probably saved something like 500,000 lives by having these people come from Europe to settle in Palestine. It's a shame that the conflict with the native Arab people became what it became. Both sides have things to blame for that. And I've been involved, from my youth with a left-wing Zionist group to the left of labor, that initially was opposed to the partition of Palestine. They wanted to see a binational Arab-Jewish state within Palestine. Um, and Unfortunately, the forces within, especially the Arab nationalist movement, totally rejected that idea. They also weren't able to persuade a majority of the Zionist movement to uh, try to find a binational solution. But the rejection of a two-state solution has repeatedly come from the Arab side. Unfortunately, because violence is in the mix here, and I did allude to one wave of terrorism. There have been numerous waves of terrorism, especially the Second Intifada, which followed a peace process. Um, and these have undercut diplomatic efforts made in good faith by Israeli governments to create a two-state solution. Now, what you have elected here is the most extreme result. You've alluded to the fact that Jabotinsky comes off as almost a liberal compared to the people in power now. And I think that's very true because Jabotinsky actually believed in a level of equal citizenship between Arabs and Jews in Israel, but he wanted to see a Jewish majority.
Again, I agree with much of what you said, particularly the point that the Zionist movement didn't have a metropolis to go back to. Nevertheless, the Zionist movement embarked on the systematic takeover of Palestine before the Holocaust. So the intention was there to start displacing the natives. So it was a colonial movement, and it was allied to the colonial power of Britain. And without British support, the Zionist movement wouldn't have been able to achieve what it has achieved. On the two-state solution, you said that it was the Arabs who rejected it. Here I beg to differ. The two-state solution enjoyed the broadest international consensus since 1967. But Israel, under right-wing governments mainly, has killed the possibility of a two-state solution.
Well,
By
I largely agree with you on that.
And so there was the option of a two-state solution. The Likud under Netanyahu has rejected that solution and expanded settlements in order to prevent the possibility of a Palestinian state. And that's why I, having supported a two-state solution for most of my political career, today I say it's dead. And therefore, my alternative to the status quo, to the genocide, and to the apartheid, my alternative is a binational state from the river to the sea with equal rights for all its citizens regardless of religion and ethnicity.
I think October 7th has put the kibosh on that. I don't see that happening. I
One of
think
the most
you have to go back to two-state solution. There's no
Well,
other alternative.
well, that's an interesting point you make, Ralph, because I remember when Rashid Khalidi first came to Colombia, he organized a one-day conference on this very theme, which was revelatory to me. And I tend to agree with you on cynically about this, but as an ideal solution to this, I tend to agree with Avi.
It's an ideal solution.
I mean,
And that's part of the problem. It's an ideal
yeah.
solution.
All right. Well, let me bring
one of
Avi
the most,
in.
if I
Yes,
can say,
go on, Chris. Go
one
on.
of is connected with many things that Abby has said.
Yep.
One of the most moving parts of the book is the epilogue, in which Avi contrasts Judaism with Zionism. Do you want to sort of summarize that, which is we put it on the dust jacket. Would you like to summarize that very clear distinction, Abby?
I did it in answer to a question, but I repeat that Judaism is a religion, and Jews live everywhere around the world, whereas Israel is a state with borders. It's a member of the United Nations. So anti-Semitism is the hatred of the people, of Jews, wherever they might be. Anti-Zionism is opposition to the state of Israel. And the two should not be confused. And to repeat what I said earlier, Israel and its friends deliberately conflate the two in order to silence legitimate, evidence-based criticisms of Israel. And never in history has there been more criticism, more outrage, more anger about the way that Israel is behaving, precisely because it has become so brutal and inhuman in its treatment of Palestinian civilians.
Yeah, that I think we can agree on. Israel has isolated itself from the international community. I mean, we never has seen the ICJ, the ICC get involved in this situation. And again, the book is the Genocide in Gaza, which is published by the Irish Pages Press. Got that right, Chris? Yes, sir.
Right.
And you can go to the website of the book and get it directly from them.
I'm a historian, so I'm much more comfortable talking about the past than speculating about the future. And when I give lectures, I don't like to end on a pessimistic note. So in the past, I often used to quote Abba Eban, the Israeli foreign minister, who said that nations are capable of acting rationally after they had exhausted all the other alternatives. So there is hope for Israel that it would start acting rationally. But after the Israeli response to the attack by Hamas, I don't see any prospect of the Israeli government acting rationally. And I'm afraid that with the present government in power, I don't see any end to this conflict, because the agenda of Netanyahu and the extremists in his government is the ethnic cleansing of the Gaza and the West Bank. And his partners don't conceal the fact that after they expel the Arabs from the West Bank, they would like to formally annex the West Bank. So I don't see that there is any impulse for change from within Israel towards a more liberal kind of Zionism and coexistence. And Israel is the stronger party, and as long as it enjoys American support, it continue to defy the whole of the international community. So I'm afraid that we have reached a phase in the conflict of terrible hatred on both sides and no, as far as I can see, no possibility of compromise or coexistence. And I'm sorry to end on this very pessimistic note. And as one of the questioners said earlier, the binational solution, the one-state solution, is an ideal. I have no illusion that it could be implemented or that it would come about in my lifetime. But the choice is not between the status quo and a two-state solution. The choice is between the status quo, which is totally repugnant to me, and the ideal of one state with equal rights. And I am an Arab Jew. I was born in Baghdad. I grew up in Israel. I served in the IDF. For my family and me, Muslim-Jewish coexistence was not an abstract idea. It wasn't a dream. It was the everyday reality. And because I had the privilege of living in an Arab country, that experience of my family enables me and encouraged me to think outside the box, outside the grim reality that we face today, and to think of a better future for the region with religious tolerance and coexistence.
Well, and that's a positive note. And we want to thank Professor Shlaim for joining us today. Professor Shlaim is the author of a compilation of essays published by the Irish Pages Press titled Genocide in Gaza, Israel's Long War on Palestine. And it was a great privilege and pleasure to have him here today. Thank you so much.
Thank you.